And you guys can have your seats. If you have your Bible with you today, turn to Hebrews chapter 4. That's where we're going to be tonight. And we are going to continue our series called Catalyst that we started just a couple weeks ago on Wednesdays. Tonight, Hebrews chapter 4 is where we're going to be. And I'm going to do something a little different. I don't normally do this, but you have the sheet that you normally have when you walk in. You may be sitting on it, or maybe it's under your seat. If you're a note-taking person, you'll notice there's some blanks. I'm actually going to give you the answers to the blanks right now at the very beginning of this. This is weird, right? Like, we don't normally do this. Normally, we build to it, then I give you the answer at the end. But right now, I'm going to tell you the one thing that I hope you remember from tonight, and it is this. Jesus is the catalyst for a new relationship with God. Jesus is the catalyst for a new relationship with God. Catalyst is this series that we're walking through, and if you remember, on the very first night of this series, we did science right here on this stage. It's not something we often do here, but we did science. We did an experiment where there was a catalyst. And then Sarah last week reminded us of that definition of what a catalyst is. It is something that creates change or speeds up a change that's already taking place. That's what a catalyst is. And again, this is that catalyst. This is a catalyst when it comes to our relationship with God. But instead of doing more science, I just wanted to show you one of the greatest science experiments ever conducted. So turn your attention to the screens for this fantastic video as we learn from this world-renowned scientist.
Ready? 3, 2, 1.
Now we're going to see it in slow motion. Was anybody expecting it to hit him in the face? Yeah. I'm sure that video is somewhere to be found on the internet. This is not that. There's a slow motion. Hair flapping majestically. And that's it. Okay, so that is a 2-liter of Diet Coke. Now, if you took a normal 2-liter of Diet Coke and shook it up and threw it on the ground, it would not do that. In order for that to happen, there has to be a catalyst in the form of Mentos. So he put Mentos inside the Diet Coke bottle. He shook it up, he put the cap back on, and he threw it down. So when the cap shot off on the impact of the ground, it turned into a rocket and shot in the air. There are fail videos of this online. You're welcome to look them up later. But I encourage you, don't try that at home, mainly because I don't want the emails from your parents tomorrow. They're like, hey, Drew, the only thing they've learned all year in Relevant is how to blow up our house. So don't do that. But that is an example of a catalyst where the Mentos interact with the Diet Coke and they speed up, or actually they cause a change to take place. And you may notice the first experiment we did 2 weeks ago, it was kind of a slower change. There were bubbles in the thing as we made a homemade lava lamp, but it wasn't, that one, as soon as the cap came off, it was like whoosh, and it was a dramatic change. What I'll say about Jesus being a catalyst is that for some people, it can be this slow change. Like over time, Jesus speaks to your heart and you begin to fall in love with him and you begin to change how you think and how you act. And eventually you put your faith in Jesus. Sometimes it's like this, where it's a really dramatic change that has obvious effects. If you've ever heard someone share their testimony, there may be testimonies that are similar to my story where I didn't really go a day of my life where I didn't hear about God. I grew up in church. And like, not physically, I wasn't born in the church building. That would be weird. But I was there like most Sundays that it was open. We were there in church and it was part of my life and my family's life. And eventually over time, I realized I needed to be saved, not necessarily from anything dramatic like that, but something no less serious of my own pride and my own sin. And so I turned my attention to Jesus and began to understand not just knowing about Jesus, but having a relationship with him. So maybe you have experienced a testimony like that. Or maybe it's more like this, where it was a dramatic change. And there are stories like this too, right? Of people in obvious rebellion from God, turning away from him, walking towards something else. And then all of a sudden one day he got their attention and everything changed for them. And it was really dramatic and sudden. Jesus, whether it's over time or in one fell swoop, Jesus causes change to the people that he comes in contact with. If you read the Bible, then you know that there are some people that when they meet Jesus, they get angry because he's trying to change them and turn themselves away from themselves and serving themselves and instead turning to serving God, and that makes them really angry. The Pharisees were angry when they came into contact with Jesus. They didn't want him messing up their system that they had built. And then others fall down and worship him immediately and cry out to him, and they're changed that way. Regardless of how we change, Jesus, by nature of who he is and what he calls us to, causes a change. He is a catalyst. When we come in contact with him, things change. Now, I want to look at these verses in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. It's just 3 verses tonight, and then one other tacked on at the end from another passage. But in Hebrews 4, there's only 3 verses we're going to look at, and they are powerful. And Tony read them for us earlier, so I want to draw your attention back to those. The first verse in this passage, verse 14, says this: "So then, since we have a great high priest," can everybody say high priest? That was good. You guys the middle schoolers struggled with that a little bit. They were asleep when I asked them that question. Y'all, I give you a B+. A high priest who has entered heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we believe. So I'm going to read it one more time. "So then, since we have a great high priest who has entered heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we believe." What on earth is a high priest? We need to understand that the Bible, while written in such a way that we can learn from it, was written originally for a specific audience. Like much of the New Testament is made up of letters that people would write with a specific audience in mind. So the book of Hebrews was not written with us as the first audience to hear it. People back in Bible times would have heard this verse and known exactly what a high priest is, because this was for God's chosen people, the nation of Israel, where they knew what a priest was, because in order to connect with God, they needed a priest to go on to God for them on their behalf. And here's what I mean. If you wanted to talk to God back in that time, you would need to pack up your family and go to the temple. And when you got there, you would have to make sacrifices, and you would bring animals to be sacrificed on your behalf, and the priest would be the one to do that. And he would be a go-between between you and God, because God understood something that we need to remember, and that is we have sinned. Every single one of us have done things that miss the mark of perfection that God sets. God is perfect and holy and good, and we often are not. And it's not just the things that we do, it's ingrained in our nature to be selfish-minded rather than others-focused, to put ourselves first. And so, because God is perfect and because we are not, there's this separation between us and him. And you see this in Genesis 1 and 2, where God's plan was to be in relationship with us. He made Adam and Eve, and they were with him in the Garden of Eden. And they walked. Imagine this. They would go on walks with the creator of the universe. And he would talk to them and call them by name, and they could hear his voice and see him and be with him. If it sounds incredible, it's because that was God's plan for us. And yet, in Genesis chapter 3, everything changed when sin entered the world. They made a choice to put themselves over God and doing the things that they thought were right rather than what God had told them was right. And there was this instant separation where God banished them from the Garden of Eden, and the first death entered the world, where animals were sacrificed to make skins for them to cover up their nakedness, whereas before they had no concept of being naked or feeling vulnerable. Now all of a sudden, because sin had entered the world, there was death with it. And so God made this plan, and right away his plan was Jesus. But in the meantime, he set up this institution of sacrifices and of priests. These men would be called to this position where they would represent God, or represent the people before God. And that's what I was just talking about a minute ago. Now, a high priest was an even more specialized role for the people of God. This was only one person at a time in the nation of Israel would be a high priest. And he alone would have access to the place where God's presence was thickest. It was inside this curtain in the temple. The temple is where you would go to worship God, and the priest would be your mediator. And then you'd, once a year, would have this ceremony for all of the nation of Israel, where the high priest would go into this special place inside a curtain that was like 3 feet thick. So it's not like a curtain, your shower curtain or something that would be easy to move. It was this big, thick curtain that separated God's presence from the rest of the temple. And there were certain things that God said needed to be put inside the Holy of Holies, this was called, the holy place. And in that, only the high priest could go, and he could only go once a year, and he had to do all this ritual cleansing before he could go. He had to approach God in a certain way. He had to bring sacrifices for his own sin before he could intercede on behalf of the people and bring sacrifices for their sin. And he would bring specific sacrifices for certain sins, and there was one sacrifice that he'd bring just in case he missed any others. because sin is such a big deal and it separates us from a perfect and holy God, and there is a penalty that must be paid for that. And God set this whole system up to remind us of the seriousness of sin, and also it points ahead to a time that there would be a better system in place. And praise be to God, we live in a time that we get to experience this. It is Jesus. And this verse reminds us that he is our high priest. And here's what this means. If we want to be in the presence of God, if we want to talk to him, if we want to experience a relationship with him, we don't have to go to the temple anymore. We don't have to bring animals for sacrifices. We don't have to wait till once a year and have a priest go for us, and a priest that would eventually die and another one would take his place. It was nothing like that, because now we have Jesus as our high priest. Jesus, who this verse says has passed through the heavens. This high priest is better than any other because he is the only one that was there at creation and created the world. He is the only one that didn't have to make sacrifices for himself. He was the sacrifice for us. And this one goes freely into the temple and into the presence of God because he has passed through the earth and gone into the heavens. Jesus, when he finished his work on this earth, when he died and rose again from the dead, he ascended into heaven and he sat down at the right hand of God because his work was finished. The sacrifices stop, and now we look to Jesus as our hope. If we want to have a relationship with God, Jesus is the catalyst. He has started all of this that we could not do for ourselves. So what does this mean for us? It means that we can change from being hopeless to being hopeful. Think about the hopelessness of the situation before, where if we wanted to be close to God, we had to go through people to get there because we weren't able to be holy enough to be in God's presence. But now Jesus gives us his righteousness on our behalf if we just put our faith in him. Jesus changes us from being hopeless to being hopeful. And the verse says that we can, as a result, hold firmly to what we believe. I want you to think about the last time you were holding on to something with all of your strength. Maybe you've been tubing before. This is my best example of that. Yes, you hold on to that puppy with everything you've got, and the minute you let go or the minute it's ripped from your grasp, what happens? Yeah, you fly for about half a second, and then you skip across the water that feels like glass. If you're at least like the way that people used to drive the boat for me. Does that happen to you guys? Are people still crazy? Yeah. Okay. So you go skipping across the water, and hopefully your bathing suit stays on, and hopefully you don't get water up your mouth. And then you come to a stop, and you probably do it again, but you might lose the skin on your hands in the process. But it's this moment where you're like holding on, and you're holding on, and all of a sudden you're like, I don't got it, and then you're toast. This is different than that. When it says, let us hold firmly to the hope that we have in Jesus, let us hold firmly to what we believe, this is different than a rope where our strength gives out because Jesus is the one holding us. We hold on to what we believe, but we're not holding on to a rope, we're holding on to a person. It's the person of Jesus whose strength never fails, who doesn't let us fall, who's there with us. This is our great high priest. Then we can hold on hope beyond all, when everything else seems lost, we can keep holding on to Jesus because he holds on to us. What does this change for us? It allows us to hold on to hope. And hope has the power to dramatically change people's lives. Let's keep reading. Verses 15 and 16 in Hebrews chapter 4 say this. This high priest of ours, this Jesus that we sang about tonight, this Jesus that we've talked about already, he understands our weaknesses. For he faced all of the same testings that we do, yet he did not sin. So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it most. So Jesus doesn't just change us from hopeless to hopeful. Jesus changes us from hopeless to helped. He helps us. I'm sure that verb tense doesn't work. It wouldn't work for your English teachers. But for us tonight at Relevant, remember that he changes us from hopeless to helped. He helps us. I want you to picture this scenario in your head for a second. Let's imagine that you are in another country that does not speak English. And let's imagine that in this other country that does not speak English, you've been hydrating really well as you've been walking around. And all of a sudden, your hydration catches up to you, and you have to pee more than you've ever had to pee in your entire life. And it is your worst nightmare because, again, they don't speak English here. So you go into a store, and this is after much walking, and you really have to go. And you walk in, or like I don't know what you do. Do you limp at this point? Whatever you do, you enter the store and you lock eyes with the person behind the counter, and you are hoping that they can help you, because if not, they may have a cleanup in aisle 2. And so you're like making contact with them, eye contact, and you look at them and you're like, please help me. I have to go to the bathroom, because you don't speak the language that they do, and you're just hoping that they have a bathroom and they speak your language. They look back at you, they lock eyes, and they speak in the language that you don't understand. It's not a good moment, right? And you see that there's a bathroom, or what you think is a bathroom. There's a sign on the door back here, but it's in a language you don't understand, the same one that they're speaking, and you don't want to risk it, because maybe that's not a bathroom. And so you're like, oh, I wish they could help me, but they can't. So you leave, and you go to the next door, and you're barely making it to this next door, but you walk in, you're like, please let them speak English, please let them speak English, please let them speak English. And you lock eyes with the person, and you say, I've got to go to the bathroom, can you please help me? They're like, then you say, do you speak English? And they go, yes, but we don't have a bathroom. You're out of luck, right? That's where we're going to end the story. Maybe don't use your imagination, but that's the end of the story. Here's why I bring this up, because I want to ask you this question. Which store attendant was more helpful to you? Neither, right? Neither one could help you. Why? Well, because in the first one, they didn't understand your problem, even though you had a thought that they had the power to help you. They couldn't understand, they couldn't relate. The second store, they could understand, they were empathetic, but they had no power to do anything about it. Neither one of those situations is helpful. Do you know what is great about Jesus? Jesus speaks English and he has a bathroom. Jesus understands us and he can do something about it. Now, here's where I want to take this goofy illustration and make it real life. The way that Jesus relates to us is way more important even than that scenario. Jesus understands our sinful temptations. Jesus was tempted to sin too because he is a human being. And yet, Jesus never gave in to those temptations. Jesus was victorious over them. So when we go to Jesus and when we go to God through him, we're talking to someone who can relate to us, who can empathize with us, who knows what it means to go through hard things. And yet, he also has the power to change our lives and do something about it. Isn't that great? This is who Jesus is. He is a high priest who can empathize with us and also is victorious over the things that we struggle with. What does that mean for us? It means we can go boldly to the throne of God through Jesus. Here's the other verse I was telling you about. It's in Matthew chapter 27. It's a big deal. Verse 51, it says this. Oh, and let me set the stage here. This is when Jesus is dying on the cross. He breathes his last breath, and this happens. At that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and rocks split apart. This is that same curtain we were talking about earlier. And it tore from top down to make it very clear that there was not a human being with some giant scissors cutting down this curtain. This tore from top to bottom because it was very evident that God himself was saying, hey, do you remember how you used to not be able to come into my presence? Because of Jesus, because of my son with whom I am well pleased, because of his death, his taking of the wrath that I have towards sin, taking it all on himself, now in his death, that separation is no more. If we put our faith in Jesus, we can approach God anytime we want to. We don't have to go through a high priest. We can pray and he hears us and he responds. We can approach his throne with boldness and he responds with grace. Jesus gives us access to God. This is incredible. How big of a deal is it that we can talk to the creator of the universe, the one who knows us and loves us anytime we want to? I don't know about you, but for me, there are times where I forget that this is a really big deal and that this is available to me. I take it for granted. It would be like if a teacher gave you a test and this teacher said, hey, this is going to be the hardest test you take all year. It's going to have so many questions on it and not the multiple choice kind. And yet, you have the whole period to do it, starting right now, and you can use your textbook, you can use the internet, you can use anything you want to complete this test. That would be pretty great, right? Some of you are like, I do that anyway. Don't tell me if that's true. Please don't do that. But that open book test, you would be foolish to hear that and go, you know what, though? I'm okay without that. I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to test this guy, this brain right here. And I'm not going to take advantage of any of the opportunities that you've given me. I'm going to do it all on my own. That would be foolish, right? especially if you were not prepared to take that test. God gives us free access to him. Like that open book test, but way better and way more important. He gives us free access to him that we can, anytime we want to, approach him with confidence and boldness. Let me ask you a question. Where do you need help most in your life? That thing that Tony invited you to pray about earlier, what was that thing? Where do you need Jesus to be a catalyst for you? Take it to the throne of God. It is available to you through what Jesus has done. God himself is available to you. Jesus is the catalyst for a new relationship with God. And Jesus is the catalyst for taking another step in your relationship with God. So whether you've been walking with him for years, whether you're still new to this whole thing, or you're trying to figure out if it's even for you, what step can you take closer to a God who knows you and loves you and would move heaven and earth to be in a relationship with you? I invite you to think about that next step and be willing and bold enough to take it tonight. Let me pray for you, and then you're going to go to small groups to talk about this a little more. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this group of students. Thank you even more for your love and your grace towards us. God, I thank you that Jesus is our great high priest. He is the greatest that has ever lived and the only one who could do the things that he did on our behalf. Thank you for the hope and the freedom that we have only in you. And I pray that you would give us clarity, that you would help us see what next step you're inviting us into, that you would help us remember that your way is not always easy, it's not even always pleasant, but it's always good because you are for us and you're with us. When this world is really hard, when following you is really hard, you give us the hope to hold on to, that you are our great high priest. So let us boldly approach you this week in a way that we never have before. In Jesus' name I pray. One final challenge as you go. I invite you this week, every night before bed, to approach God's throne with boldness in prayer about whatever went on in your day, wherever you need him most, and watch as he begins to change your heart as he does it. I love you guys. Have a great night. Go to small groups.